Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This is Ground Lesson 2 in our instrument training series. In this video we're going to take an in-depth look at instrument approaches. We'll be discussing what they are and what they do, how they're built, how to fly them, and how to read the charts associated with them. Before we get started, I'll mention that this video assumes that you have a basic grasp on the fundamentals of instrument flying and the various forms of electronic navigation, such as VOR and GPS navigation. If that's not the case, make sure to check out my videos on those topics to get caught up. You should also be familiar with holding patterns and procedure turns, and it's a good idea to have a working knowledge of departure or en route and arrival charts, as much of the symbology is the same between the different types of charts. So I'll leave a link to all of those videos, and I'll also leave a link to the playlist of the entire instrument training series for those of you who want to start at the beginning or check out another video in the series. Like IFR en route, departure, and arrival charts, instrument approach charts are produced by both the FAA and Jeppesen. I'll be centering this lesson on reading FAA charts, and I won't be discussing Jeppesen charts. Once you understand the basics of instrument approaches and can read FAA charts, transitioning to Jeppesen charts is not difficult and the differences are minimal. There are also plenty of videos out there on using Jeppesen charts and Navigraph, which provides a subscription service for Jeppesen en route and terminal procedure charts with worldwide coverage for flight simmers. All the charts we'll be using today are available through skyvector.com, which makes FAA charts available to the public for free for the U.S. and its territories. So what is an instrument approach? An instrument approach is a published navigation procedure that allows pilots to safely navigate from the en route environment to an airport or runway for landing in instrument meteorological conditions. With the exception of Category 2 and 3 ILS approaches, which generally use either auto land or a heads-up display, the purpose of most instrument approaches is to allow the pilot to navigate on instruments to a point close enough and low enough to the runway that they can acquire the runway visually and land in conditions of low visibility and low cloud ceilings. The FAA and most international organizations divide instrument approaches into two broad categories: precision approaches and non-precision approaches, though the waters have gotten muddied here in the last few years, and there are now two subcategories of non-precision approaches: those with GPS or FMS generated vertical guidance and those without. Precision approaches are procedures that provide both lateral or side-to-side guidance to the runway and vertical or up and down guidance to the runway in the form of a glide slope that's transmitted to the aircraft from an outside source. The most common type of precision approach is the instrument landing system, or ILS, though many pilots would argue that any type of approach that includes an externally transmitted glide slope is a precision approach, such as an LDA with Glideslope. Non-precision approaches with vertical guidance are approaches that have lateral guidance and vertical guidance that's generated by an onboard system such as a GPS or FMS. These systems generate and display a glide path for the pilot to follow on the approach. The vast majority of these types of approaches, and to my knowledge the only ones that you can fly in flight sim, are RNAV GPS approaches that have vertical guidance, such as LPV, LNAV plus VNAV, and RNAV RNP approaches. I'll be doing an in-depth video on GPS approaches where we get into what all of that means. Non-precision approaches without vertical guidance give you lateral guidance to the runway or airport, but no vertical guidance of any kind. There are a wide variety of these types of approaches. These include RNAV approaches that don't have vertical guidance, such as LP and LNAV approaches, localizer approaches, which is basically an ILS but without the glide slope, VOR approaches, localizer back course approaches, localizer type directional aid or LDA approaches. These can have glide slopes or not have glide slopes, but the types without the glide slopes are considered non-precision approaches. Simplified directional facility or SDF approaches. These are very rare. There are not many of them left in the world. In fact, as far as I know, there's only one left that's operational in the United States. And then NDB approaches, and these are on the rare side now too. There are a few more than there are SDF approaches, but there are only a handful of these left in the United States as well. So let's take a look at approach charts, sometimes called approach plates. When we look at an approach chart, there are two views of the approach on the chart. The largest view on the chart is called the plan view, which is a map of the approach like we're looking down on it from above, like a standard map. And like most aviation maps, it's oriented with north at the top. Located under this view is the profile view, which is a view of the last few segments of the approach viewed from the side. This view is helpful for showing the vertical path of the final few segments of the approach. Like with standard terminal arrivals and standard instrument departures, the chart depicts the main body of the approach with thick black course lines on both the plan view and the profile view. Approaches are typically divided into four segments: initial, intermediate, final approach, and the missed approach segment. Let's take a look at how these segments are put together to make an approach. We'll talk about the purpose of each segment, starting at the runway and working our way backwards, and then we'll talk about the missed approach. On most approaches, the final approach segment is aligned with the runway, and it allows the pilot to make a safe descent from the last level altitude on the approach down towards the runway. The final approach segment is typically 3 to 5 miles long. It starts at a point called the final approach fix or final approach point. On an approach with no vertical guidance, the final approach fix is labeled FAF on the plan view. On the profile view, it is depicted with a big black X called a Maltese cross. On these approaches, the final approach fix is where you start your descent to the minimum descent altitude or MDA. On an approach with vertical guidance, the final approach fix is wherever you intercept and start your descent on the glide slope or glide path. The minimum glide slope or glide path intercept point is depicted with what the FAA officially designates a zigzag line. On an approach with vertical guidance, you track the glide slope or glide path to the decision altitude or DA. On the final approach segment, you should be configured or configuring for landing and flying at or reducing to your approach speed. When you first start flying instrument approaches, I recommend configuring and getting on your approach speed prior to the final approach fix, and that's always good technique for approaches without vertical guidance. As you gain more experience and become more comfortable and proficient in flying instrument approaches, it's fine to begin configuring for landing and reducing to your approach speed as you intercept the glide slope or glide path or pass a certain altitude on the glide slope or glide path on an approach with vertical guidance. In fact, that's the technique that's used by most professional flight departments. Hopefully the final approach segment will end with you seeing the runway environment and transitioning to a visual landing, but the FARs do set forth some criteria that need to be met for you to be able to descend below the MDA or DA on an instrument approach in FAR 91-175. So basically there are three parts to this rule, and then the third part has a lot of specifics to it. The first rule is that the aircraft must be in a position from which a descent to landing on the intended runway can be made using a normal rate of descent and using normal maneuvers. Basically, if you're having to do something abnormal like a very high rate of descent or an extreme bank angle in order to make it from where you are to make a landing on the runway, then you should go missed approach rather than attempting that unusual maneuver. The second rule is that the flight visibility must not be less than the visibility prescribed on the standard approach that you're using. With the minimums, we have usually a ceiling MDA or DA and then a visibility minimum, and we'll look at those in depth here in a little bit. But the flight visibility cannot be less than what the visibility is on an approach plate. Notice that it does say flight visibility, so this is not the visibility that is reported on the ground. It is what you see in the air, but it must be at or above the visibility prescribed on the approach procedure. And then the final rule is that you have to have one of the following things distinctly visible and identifiable. Basically, they go through and make a very detailed rule about what you can see, what you need to see to be able to land from an instrument approach. So the first rule is that you can descend below the MDA or DA if you get the approach lighting system in sight, but there is an exception to that rule, that you cannot go below 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation using only the approach lights. Some people will tell you that if you get the approach lights in sight, you can descend another 100 feet. That's a true statement if you're flying a standard Category 1 ILS with a 200-foot decision height. but that is not necessarily true if your DA or MDA is higher than that. You're not descending below the DA or MDA, you're descending to above the touchdown zone elevation, and we'll look at where we find that here in a little bit. There is an exception to that exception that says if you see the red terminating bars on an ALSAF 1 type system, or you see the red side row bars on an ALSAF 2 type system, you can go ahead and descend below that 100 feet and descend to a landing if you have that in sight. You can also descend below MDA or DA if you get the runway end identifier lights. These are white strobe lights on either side of the runway threshold. You can descend below MDA or DH if you have any visual glide slope indicator in sight, if you have a VASI or a PAPI. And then if you see the runway threshold, the actual pavement, or the threshold markings, or the lights, you can go ahead and descend. If you can see the touchdown zone or the touchdown zone markings or touchdown zone lights, you can go ahead and descend. And then if you see any part of the runway, the pavement or the markings or the lights, you can go ahead and descend and land. If you don't get the runway in sight, the final approach segment will end at a point called the missed approach point, or MAP. If you reach the missed approach point and either don't have the required visual cues in sight or you're not in a position from which you can make a safe landing, it's time to execute the missed approach and transition to the missed approach segment. And we'll talk about that segment here in a little bit. So where is the missed approach point and how do you know when you're there? On a precision approach or any approach with vertical guidance, it's pretty straightforward. You follow the glide slope or glide path down to a decision altitude or DA, and this also serves as your missed approach point. At this point, you have to make a decision as to whether you have the required visual cues in sight and can safely land, or if you need to execute the missed approach procedure. On an approach with no vertical guidance, the missed approach point is a geographical point rather than an altitude. Typically, it's located at the threshold of the runway you're making the approach to, but since you can't see that in IMC, you'll need another way to tell you you're there. That could be a GPS waypoint, a DME fix, a VOR cross radial, an NDB bearing, or even by timing from the final approach fix, depending on the approach you're flying. If you reach the missed approach point and don't have the visual cues you need to land or aren't in a position to make a safe landing, it's time to execute the missed approach. Now let's move back and talk about the intermediate segment. It's located just prior to the final approach fix and segment and is used to position the aircraft for final approach. Like the final approach segment, it's typically 3 to 5 miles in length and usually has a course of no more than 30 degrees from that of the final approach segment. This segment starts at the intermediate fix, which is labeled IF on the chart, and terminates at the final approach fix or point. Some approaches may have multiple intermediate segments. Like we talked about earlier, it's good technique to use this segment to configure the aircraft for landing and slow to your approach speed once you're level at the altitude for this segment on approaches that don't have vertical guidance, and even on those that do until you've got some experience flying approaches. The altitude for this segment is sometimes referred to as the platform altitude, since it's the last level altitude segment on the approach before you begin your descent on the final approach segment. You'll notice on the plan view that this segment has a segment altitude, magnetic course, and segment distance depicted, and this is true of all approach segments depicted on the chart other than the final approach. Now let's back up and look at the initial approach segment. The purpose of this segment is to transition the aircraft from the en route environment onto the approach. It starts at an initial approach fix, which is labeled IAF on the chart. An initial approach fix is a fix a pilot can navigate to in the en route environment to begin the approach. It can be something you can navigate directly to, like a VOR, NDB, or a GPS waypoint, or it might be something like an airway fix that you can't navigate directly to without a GPS, but that you can navigate to via en route navigation on something like a Victor airway. When you begin an approach at an initial approach fix, you may need to perform a procedure turn or a hold in lieu of a procedure turn to establish yourself on the approach. As I mentioned earlier, if you're not familiar with that procedure, I do have a video all about that I've left a link to in this video's description. Initial approach segments where a procedure turn is not to be used will be indicated with no PT on the segment. The initial approach segments are about 3 to 5 miles in length, just like the other segments of the approach, and there may be a few different initial approach segments on a single approach to give pilots approaching the airport from different directions options on how they begin the approach. For example, if I'm approaching the airport from the southeast over here, the most efficient way to get on the approach is to navigate to Nybeck and then proceed on the rest of the approach like that. If I'm approaching from the southwest, the most efficient way is to go direct to Willis and then hit that as the initial approach fix and then navigate in on the approach like that. And then if I'm approaching anywhere from above that line that Nybeck and Willis make up from the north here, the most efficient way to get on the approach is to navigate to Zedek as the initial approach or as the intermediate fix and then on the approach that way. And sometimes you'll see on approaches that a fix will be labeled both as an intermediate fix and initial approach fix. I can use Zedek as an initial approach fix, but I do have to do the procedure turn if I'm going to go in that way. And the way that works is if I'm flying up from an area that I would need to use that procedure turn, I can fly over Zedek. And the first time I hit Zedek and then proceed out onto the holding pattern in lieu of the procedure turn, Zedek is an initial approach fix. And then as I fly back over Zedek the second time, that's now an intermediate fix. So that's how that works and why sometimes a fix is labeled as both an initial fix and a intermediate fix. Many instrument approaches also have feeder routes. These routes allow a pilot to navigate from a fix or nav aid in the en route structure that's not a part of the approach to an initial approach fix. The fixes where these routes start can be nav aids, airway fixes, or GPS waypoints. The routes are depicted on the plan view as thinner black course lines, similar to how transitions are depicted on departure and arrival procedures. Like most approach segments, they have a minimum altitude for the route, a magnetic course, and a distance, in this case to the initial approach fix, depicted on them. They may also include notes about restrictions on using that particular feeder route. For example, if we look at the feeder route that's going from Little Rock to Nybeck intersection, Little Rock VOR or Little Rock VORTAC, it says the procedure is not authorized for arrivals at Little Rock VORTAC if they're arriving via Victor 305 southwest bound. A similar note is down here for the Drast intersection that it's not available if you're arriving Drast via Victor 47 southwest bound. So now let's fast forward back to the end of the approach and take a look at the missed approach segment. As mentioned earlier, if we get to the end of our approach at the missed approach point and we either don't see the runway or we can't make a safe landing, we need to perform the missed approach procedure. A missed approach procedure, or the missed approach segment of the approach, is basically a go-around, but one that's carefully designed, both laterally and vertically, to keep the aircraft safely away from obstacles and terrain and get it back up to a safe altitude while navigating away from the airport in instrument conditions. Most missed approach procedures end at a missed approach holding point, where you can enter a holding pattern and start to make some decisions about what you'd like to do next. Missed approach procedures and instructions are depicted in several different places on the chart. A textual description of the procedure is printed at the top right corner of the chart. The initial route and the missed approach hold are depicted with dashed lines on the plan view, and a graphical depiction of the missed approach instructions is depicted in the top right corner of the profile view as well. For example, if we're looking at the RNAV GPS to runway 18 in Stuttgart, in the top right corner of the approach plate, it has the missed approach instructions. These are pretty straightforward. It says climb to 2000. It doesn't say anything about turns, so we just assume that that is a climb straight out. And then it says proceed direct to Hogum intersection and hold. So fairly straightforward. Then if we look at the plan view down here, you can see at the end of runway 18 at the departure end, it depicts the dashed lines going straight out, as it told us in the textual description. And then a little box here, it's got the holding fix, and they put this in a little box because it's not to scale with the rest of the plan view, and it's not exactly in the right place on the chart. This is not where it is in the real world. I suspect it's probably down here somewhere. You could look at an en route chart to see that. And then it depicts the holding pattern. So you would do a right turn, 4 nautical mile legs in the holding pattern with an inbound course of 360. And then it gives a graphical depiction on the top right corner of the profile view. That's what these little symbols are here. So you can see it says go straight ahead 2000 and go to Hogan. Now that we've talked about all the different segments of the approach and how the lateral path is flown, let's talk about the vertical portion. Most approaches have an altitude called the minimum safe altitude, or MSA. It's depicted somewhere on the plan view in a circle with a fix located at the center. On the outside of the circle, it says MSA, gives the name of the fix in the center, and the distance from the fix that the MSA is applicable. This distance is usually 25 nautical miles, but may be as large as 30 nautical miles. The MSA guarantees that you will be at least 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle when you're in the MSA area. A chart can have more than one MSA. In fact, it can have up to 4. In these cases, the MSA circle will be divided into sectors off the MSA fix based on headings to that fix. So to look at some examples here, this is from the Stuttgart RNAV to runway 18, and the MSA fix is runway 18. So the runway 18 missed approach point on that approach, and it tells us that the circle is 25 nautical miles, and then it tells us that the MSA and the entire sector is 2,500 feet. So we know as long as we stay at or above 2,500 feet when we're within 25 nautical miles of runway 18 there at Stuttgart, we know that we've got at least 1,000 feet of obstacle clearance. Looking at one with multiple sectors, this is up in northwest Arkansas. This approach, the MSA sector is based on Razorback VOR. So it tells us Razorback VOR, and again, it's a standard 25-mile MSA, but then we have multiple different sectors. And you can see if we're on a heading of 090, or if we're in a location that is 090 heading would take us to the VOR clockwise around to a 270 heading. So basically anywhere to the north of the VOR, then the MSA is going to be 3,200 feet. If we are on a 360 heading or on the 180 radial around clockwise to the 090 degree radial, the MSA is 3,600 feet. And then if we're in this bottom right corner here, 270 heading around to a 360 heading to the VORTAC, then 4,500 is the MSA, so quite a bit higher than the top sector there. In the real world, the MSA is only provided as an emergency reference on the chart so that if you need to make an emergency descent for some reason, you know how low you can go without risking compromising your obstacle clearance. In the real world, you should never descend from your assigned altitude to this altitude without clearance to do so. In Flight Sim, though, if you're not using any sort of air traffic control, you can use this altitude coupled with MEAs and off-route obstacle clearance altitudes, or OROCAs, from en route charts to determine when you can descend from your cruise altitude and how low you can go, and just assume that you would be getting a clearance to that altitude from ATC. We'll look at a couple of specific examples in a few minutes. It's important to pay close attention to what the MSA fix is. While final approach fixes and missed approach points are often used as the MSA fix, it can also be something that's relatively far from the airport or the approach, and it can be a fix it's not easy to determine your distance from. As far as the rest of the altitudes on the approach are concerned, the altitudes depicted on each segment and feeder route of the approach on both the plan view and the profile view are referred to as procedure altitudes. You can descend to a procedure altitude depicted on an approach when you're established on that segment of the approach or that feeder route and you have been cleared for the approach. So let's take a look at some examples of how this would work and how I would use it in Flight Simulator. Let's assume that my aircraft is over in this position here, about 10 miles away from Stuttgart. I have filed an IFR flight plan to Stuttgart, and that is what I'm navigating to at this point. And I know that I'm 10 miles away from Stuttgart, so I know that the MSA is based on the runway 18 missed approach point. And as long as I am within 25 nautical miles of that point, then I could descend down to 2,500 feet and I would have my obstacle clearance. Again, in the real world, you would not do this unless you actually got clearance from ATC to do that. But in Flight Sim, you can use this as a tool to determine how low you can go when you're approaching the airport and just assume that you get the ATC clearance. So let's assume that we get the following clearance. We've loaded up the approach and it's standing by. We just need to activate it. We're going to go in on NIBAC as our initial approach fix. So ATC calls up and they say Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel. You're cleared direct to NIBAC. Descend and maintain 2,500 feet until established on the approach. You're cleared for the RNAV GPS runway 18. So again, I'm within 10 nautical miles of Stuttgart, so I know I'm within this MSA range, so I know it's safe to go down to 2,500 feet. So I'll go ahead and start that descent. I'll go ahead and activate the approach and go direct to NIBAC and navigate up that way. I'll level at 2,500 feet until I get to NIBAC. Once I hit NIBAC, then I will go ahead and turn on this initial approach course here. And I have been cleared for the approach, so I can use the procedure altitude that's here. So I can go ahead and descend down to 2,000 feet, and I'll fly inbound to Zedek. And once I get to Zedek, I do not have to do the procedure turn because it says no PT here, so I don't need to do the hold or the procedure turn. And then I will turn inbound on the intermediate segment to Tukok. Once I'm established on that segment, the procedure altitude here is 1,900 feet. I am cleared for the approach, so I can go ahead and go down to 1,900 feet. I'll maintain that 1,900 feet until I reach Tukok, which is our final approach fix, or if I'm flying this as an LPV approach or an LNAV VNAV approach until I intercept the glide path. And at that point, I can descend down to my DA or my MDA. So let's take a look at an example using a feeder route. So let's assume that we are coming up from the southeast here, heading up to the north-northwest. So let's assume we're at a cruising altitude of 4,000 feet. And again, we're about 15 miles away from Stuttgart. Maybe we use our moving map on our GPS and the range ring on that to determine that that's about where we are. And so we know we're within 25 nautical miles of our MSA fix, so it'd be safe to go down to 2,500 feet. Again, in the real world, you could not do that until you got a clearance. So let's assume we get a clearance at this point. They say proceed direct DRAST, descend and maintain 2,500 feet until established on the approach. You're cleared for the RNAV GPS runway 18 into Stuttgart. And so we go ahead and descend to 2,500 feet and we put in direct DRAST and navigate up there. Once we get to DRAST, you are considered established on the approach once you join a feeder route for that approach. So these procedure altitudes still apply. So at that point, we can go ahead and descend to 2,000 and then we will track up here from DRAST up to Willis. Once we hit Willis, we will turn on the initial approach segment. It's 2,000 feet here, so we don't need to descend. We're level at 2,000, so we'll stay there. Again, it says no procedure turn when you're coming in from this way, so we don't have to do that hold in lieu of the procedure turn there. So we'll track that course inbound to Zedek. Once we get to Zedek, we'll turn inbound on the intermediate course or the intermediate segment. Again, we've got that 1,900 foot altitude there, so we'll go ahead and descend down to there, and it's just like the approach coming in the other way. You hit your final approach fix or intercept your glide path, you can descend down to the DA or the MDA. The symbology for altitudes is the same on the profile view, or much the same on the profile view as it is on arrival charts. So if you see an altitude with lines above and below it, that means you need to cross that fix or waypoint at that altitude. If you see an altitude with a line below it, that means you need to cross that fix or waypoint above that altitude. And then if you see an altitude with a line above it, that means that you need to cross that fix or waypoint below that altitude. And then if you see two altitudes with lines above and below them, that means you need to cross that fix or waypoint between those two altitudes. Some approach procedures now have terminal arrival areas or TAAs in place of MSAs. TAAs are similar to MSAs, but they are different in a couple of key areas. You can tell that you have a TAA if it looks like somebody has taken your MSA circle and cut it into 3 parts, basically a half circle and 2 quarter circles. And a TAA is similar to an MSA in that the altitudes in these sectors will give you 1,000 foot clearance from your obstacles. A couple of the key differences on a TAA is that these altitudes are procedure altitudes for this approach, so that if you are in these sectors and you're cleared for the approach, you can go ahead and descend to these altitudes. Another key difference is where an MSA is based on a single fix, a TAA is based on multiple fixes. Usually the TAAs are built around approaches that have this T kind of configuration where you have kind of 2 wings and then a center point. So your half circle will be based on the center point fix, and then your other 2 fixes will be based on kind of the wing point fixes here. You'll also notice the third difference is that the sectors are subdivided into different distance sectors. So, for example, if we're looking at the PAB-B fix down here, if we are 30 miles from PAB-B, but more than 8 nautical miles, then the TAA altitude is 4,300 feet. If we are inside of 8 nautical miles from PAB-B, then our TAA altitude is now 3,500 feet. So let's look at an example of how you would use a TAA. Let's assuming that we're coming from this direction and we're navigating direct to Irui. Let's say that we're 20 nautical miles away from Irui, and ATC, we're cruising, we'll say, at 6,000 since we're heading southwest bound. ATC calls us up and they say proceed direct to Irui, maintain 6,000 until established on the approach. You're cleared for the RNAV GPS to runway 7 at Russellville, which is where this approach is. So since we are already within 30 nautical miles, we can go ahead and descend from 6,000 down to 3,900 feet. When we get to 15 nautical miles from Irui, we can go ahead and go down to 3,500 feet. Once we hit Irui, we'll turn in, and it says no procedure turn on this initial segment here. So once we turn at Irui, we'll track this course inbound to PAB-B. We maintain 3,500 feet there. Once we hit PAB-B, we can turn inbound towards NACB, which is our final approach fix. On this segment, we are cleared for the approach, so we can descend on down to 2,800 feet. And then once we hit NACB, we can go ahead and either intercept the glide path or descend to our MDA from that point. So that is a brief overview of how terminal arrival areas work. So another vertical navigation symbol that you will see on non-precision approach charts or charts for approaches that do not have vertical guidance is this little black triangle here. This is called a visual descent point. The FAA definition of a visual descent point is a point on the final approach course of a non-precision approach, particularly one without vertical guidance, from which a normal descent from the MDA to the runway touchdown point may be commenced. So what does that mean? Well, there are 2 ways to fly approaches that don't have vertical navigation. You can descend very quickly down to your MDA and then level off at the MDA and fly horizontally until you get to the missed approach point, and then if you see something, you descend to land, and if you don't, you go missed approach. This is often referred to as the dive and drive technique, and we'll get more into this when we start talking in depth about approaches without vertical guidance. The other technique that you can use is to calculate a descent rate that would keep you pretty much on a normal glide path. And if you use this technique, then the VDP is about where you should hit that MDA on that normal glide path. The thing you need to be aware of with a VDP is that if you hit the VDP and you are at MDA and you don't see anything and you can't go any lower, you need to be aware that as you get closer to the runway, that even if you get it in sight, you may not be able to use a normal rate of descent to landing. In other words, you may be too high, and it may not be safe, even though you see the runway, to attempt to land from that position. So if you get beyond the MDA, just be aware that you may be too high, even if you get the runway in sight, to do a normal landing, and you may still have to go missed approach. Another thing that you'll sometimes see on approaches without vertical guidance is step-down fixes inside the final approach fix. So basically, you'll have another fix inside the final approach fix. In this example, we have the Zugme intersection, and it has an altitude of 1480. So if we're flying this approach, once we get inside of Shiloh intersection, we descend down to 2100 feet, we slow down, we configure, and then we hit the final approach fix, we'll start descending, but we can't go to the MDA. We have to go to this step down fix instead. So we'll descend down to 1480 until we get to Zugme intersection. And then once we get to Zugme intersection, we can go ahead and go down to our MDA of 1280. You can also see step-down fixes outside of the final approach fix as well. They're depicted in the same manner and they work the same way. You fly at the altitude depicted prior to the fix. At that altitude, you cross the fix, you descend down to the next altitude. You hit the fix, you descend down to the next altitude. So they work exactly the same. It's just a little more critical that you pay attention to the altitudes if you're inside the final approach fix to make sure you don't compromise obstacle clearance while you're on the approach. A few other things I want to point out on the profile view. On a precision approach at the opposite end from where the runway is on the profile view, you will see this little data block. You will also see it on non-precision approaches that have vertical guidance. With a precision approach, this is the angle of the glide slope. So in this case, the glide slope angle is 3 degrees. And then it tells you underneath that box, TCH stands for threshold crossing height. So if you stay on the electronic glide slope, which is depicted with this little gray feather-looking thing here, then you will cross the threshold of the runway at 50 feet above the threshold. It displays the same thing for an approach with vertical guidance, a non-precision approach with vertical guidance, except here it is the GP, the glide path, that's generated by the system rather than the glide slope that's generated externally. And again, you still have that threshold crossing height. So it tells you you'll cross 4,500 or 45 feet above the threshold if you stay on that GPS generated glide path. This is an important thing to look at because while most of them are 3 degrees, which is pretty standard, there are some approaches, particularly out west, where this glide slope angle or glide path angle is a little higher, and you'll need a little bit of a steeper angle of or steeper rate of descent to stay on that glide slope or glide path. You'll also see this data block on non-precision approaches that don't have vertical guidance when they have a visual descent point or VDP. What it is when you see it on those approaches is a visual descent angle or a VDA. And you'll notice that instead of being way over here on the opposite end of the runway, it's usually right by the final approach fix. What this is the glide path angle that you need to fly from the VDP to the runway to touch down at the appropriate point on the runway. There's not going to be any sort of guidance for that. It's just, it's the normal glide path angle that you would want to fly on a visual approach. And it tells you if you fly that glide path angle correctly, you should cross the threshold at 47 feet. A few other things I want to point out on the profile view before we move on to looking at minimums. Sometimes you'll have notes at the top of the profile view. Most of the time, these notes indicate that like the electronic glide slope, if you're flying a precision approach, or the glide path, or just your descent angle on the approach are not the same as your VASI or your PAPI. This particular note says that the VGSI, which is your visual glide slope indicator, so in this case it says P, so that is a PAPI, and the descent angle on the approach are not coincident. Probably what's going on here is the PAPI is in a slightly different place as far as where it indicates the touchdown zone is than the angle on the approach here. And this can happen actually with electronic glide slopes on ILSs. And basically it's kind of a heads up that, hey, if you stay on the electronic glide slope or you calculate your own glide path when you're flying a non-precision approach, It's not the same. It's not exactly in the same place as the VASI glide slope or the PAPI glide slope. So you may break out, and the VASI or PAPI may indicate that you're slightly high or slightly low. And just to give you a heads up to be alert for that. Usually it's not a big difference. You can see here it says that the VASI glide slope angle is still 3 degrees, just like the visual descent angle is. And then the threshold crossing height for the VASI is 44 feet versus 47 feet for the visual descent angle. So not a huge difference, but just something they want to make you aware of. Another bit of data that is on the profile view is you'll notice that they have at the very bottom the distance between fixes or important points on the approach. You can see here they tell us it's 4.9 miles between Sheila and Wonan. They tell it's 1.9 miles between Wonan, which is our final approach fix, and Zugmi, which is that step down fix. They then say that it's another 0.6 miles to get from Zugmi to the visual descent point, and then it's 2.4 miles from the visual descent point to the runway threshold. This is just kind of FYI information to let you know what the distances are here. And another thing to be aware of on the profile view is that sometimes you can identify fixes on the approach with DME. If that's the case, they will use that same sort of D-shaped symbol to let you know what the DME distance is that identifies that fix, and then they will tell you beside that what the station is that you get the DME from. So in this case, all the fixes on this approach are identified with DME from IFYV, which is the localizer for runway 16 here in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And so Elmi intersection is identified with 11 DME. That's where we transition from the initial approach segment to the intermediate segment and can descend down to 2,500 feet. And then at Hog intersection is our final approach fix. That's identified with 5 DME. That is our final approach fix where we can start our descent down to, in this case, our step down fix. The step down fix is identified with 3.7 DME. Then our visual descent point is identified with 2.7 DME, and the runway threshold is identified with 1.2 DME, so that is our missed approach point. And it's 1.2 DME because the localizer is down here at the other end of the runway, and it's a 6,000-foot runway. So that's how far away the end of the runway is from the opposite end where the localizer is located. You can also have, even if you're shooting an ILS, you can have DME from a source other than the localizer. And again, it will tell you right here. You can see on this approach, most of the intersections are identified with DME from Fort Smith VOR, FSM, rather than from the localizer. It doesn't look like the localizer has DME. It doesn't have a channel on there. So that tells us that the localizer probably does not have DME. So IAXI intersection is identified with 17 DME. Jimbo, it tells us you can't identify with DME. You have to either use radar from air traffic control in the real world, or in flight sim you could use a GPS. And then Fort Smith, the visual descent point is identified with 7.4 DME. And then our missed approach point of the runway threshold for the localizer approach is identified with 6.3 DME from the VOR. So some other miscellaneous things I want to point out on the plan view of the chart before we move on to looking at minimums. The symbology for nav aids is basically the same as it is on en route, arrival, and departure charts. So the symbology for VORs, VORTACs, VOR-DMEs, and NDBs is all going to be the same. It's the same symbols. You're still going to have a data box for each nav aid. It will give you the name of the facility. It will give you the frequency of the facility. It will give you the 3-letter identifier of the facility, and then it'll give you the identifier in Morse code if you need to listen to that on the radio to identify the station. And then any nav aid that has DME or is equipped with DME has a channel information down at the bottom. So that's your indication that the station has DME. Jeppesen charts are nice. They just say whether or not it has DME. If it says it has DME, it does. And so any box that does not have a channel in it means that it does not have DME. You'll notice that the box that is the primary nav aid for the approach is bolded, and with localizers, you'll notice that it doesn't give any station name. It just says it's a localizer, and you know it's the localizer for the runway 8. And then it gives the frequency, and then it gives the identifier, and you'll notice that those are always 4 letters on localizers, and they always start with an I, and then it gives you the Morse code for that. The other thing that we'll point out is that there are these thin radial lines, and sometimes you'll see them as NDB bearing lines. Those are thinner than both the main body of the approach and any transit or any feeder routes that you have on the approach. These are just radials that are used to identify intersections. They are not navigable routes. So if you see really thin lines like that, that's what they are. For example, this here shows you that the OEG intersection or the OEG fix can be identified by being off the 297 degree radial from Fort Smith VOR at 17 DME. You'll also notice that on this chart they depict the restricted areas that are near the airport. They are not color-coded, but they do give the identifier for the airspace. The other thing that's of note on the chart is that water is depicted. Rivers, lakes, and oceans are all depicted on approach charts. Part of the reason they do this is to give you an awareness of when you're over a large body of water, so that you're aware, like if you're beyond power off gliding distance from shore. And also, it's partly a carryover from the old days when larger bodies of water would interfere with nav aids like NDBs and the equipment that came before that. So part of it's just a holdover from those days. You'll also notice that obstacles are depicted in a similar way to the way they're depicted on sectional charts. They're depicted with a little triangle with a dot in the middle, and then it gives you the altitude where the top of the obstacle is located. Unlike the sectional chart, they don't give you the distance your aircraft will fall when you hit it. It just gives you the altitude that your altimeter will read when you hit the top of the obstacle. The tallest obstacle on the plan view will be depicted in with a larger symbol and a larger font size. And then if you have terrain, significant terrain that's around the airport, that will be indicated with just a black dot, and it will tell you where the top of that terrain is. And then the highest terrain on the plan view, again, will get the larger symbol and the larger font. In mountainous areas where the terrain is a significant factor, they actually will color the terrain and give you contour lines for that terrain, and then have different colors for the different levels of terrain. And again, the dots indicate where the highest or where the terrain tops out in that particular area, and the highest terrain will get the large symbol and the larger font. So let's take a look at approach minimums. Approach minimums are divided into 5 categories, which are given letter designations, A, B, C, D, or E. These categories are based on the published aircraft approach or landing speed as published by the manufacturer, or if there is no published approach or landing speed, it is based on 1.3 times the stall speed and the landing configuration. Both the landing speeds and the stall speeds are based on what that speed will be when the aircraft is at the maximum landing weight. With larger aircraft, the speeds can vary significantly depending on whether the aircraft is light or heavy. Category A aircraft are those that have approach speeds of less than 91 knots. Most of your light general aviation aircraft are going to fall into this category. The Cessna 172 is solidly in that category. Category B aircraft are those that have approach speeds between 91 and 120 knots. Most of your light twins will fall in this category. Category C aircraft are those that have approach speeds between 121 and 140 knots. This is going to be some of your smaller airliners and many of your light corporate jets and some turboprops. Category D aircraft are going to be those with approach speeds between 141 to 165 knots. This is going to be most of your airliners. And then Category E is approach speeds of 166 knots or more. Primarily, this is going to be military aircraft. It's important to note that at fields where they don't see a lot of traffic from a particular category, they will not have minimums for that category of aircraft. For example, at civilian fields that don't see any military traffic, they will not have approach minimums published for Category E aircraft. Likewise, military airfields, when they have high ILS approaches that are shot pretty much exclusively by high-speed military aircraft, they may not have approach minimums published for A and B category aircraft. And the approach minimums are located at the bottom of the chart underneath the profile view. And you'll notice there are several horizontal lines going across for the minimums. Each one of these horizontal lines represents a different approach. So for this particular approach here, this is S is straight in. So this is the straight in ILS to runway 8. These are the minimums for that approach. And you'll notice that all categories of aircraft have the same minimums for this approach. You can also shoot a ILS approach without the glide slope. You can use just the localizer. It becomes the straight in localizer approach. And you'll notice that category A and B have one set of minimums, and then category C, D, and E have a different set of minimums. You can also come in and shoot an approach to run runway and then choose to land on another runway. That's referred to as a circling approach. And you have higher minimums for that. And you'll notice we have minimums for Cat A and B aircraft, and a separate set of minimums for Category C aircraft, and then another set of minimums for Category D and E aircraft. This is looking at a GPS approach down here. We have several different types that we can shoot. If we have an LPV approach, it actually tells us this is a DA. And so this is the minimums for that approach. Then if you're using LNAV, VNAV, this is the minimums for that approach. LNAV without vertical guidance, these are the minimums here. And then you have circling minimums published as well. So what do all these numbers mean? The first number you come across is your minimum descent altitude or decision altitude. As we discussed earlier, if you're shooting an approach with vertical guidance, this is going to be a decision altitude or DA. If you're shooting a non-precision approach without vertical guidance, this is going to be a minimum descent altitude or MDA. This is the altitude that you will read on your altimeter when you get to the MDA or the decision altitude or DA. The next number is the minimum visibility for the approach. With Part 91 operations, you can actually shoot the approach with less than this visibility, but you need to at least have this flight visibility to be able to descend below MDA or DA. For commercial operations, they cannot even shoot the approach if they are outside of the final approach fix without this visibility, at least this visibility, being reported. The next number is the height above touchdown zone elevation, or the HAT, of your minimum descent altitude or decision altitude. That tells you when you reach the minimum descent altitude or decision altitude, how high you are going to be off the ground at that altitude. And then the next set of numbers in parentheses is for military users and not for civilian pilots. It's usually fairly close to the height above touchdown and minimum visibility that is established for civilian operators, but as you can see, it's about 50 feet off for this approach. So again, civilian pilots can just disregard this set of minimums. Visibility minimums on most charts are listed in miles and fractions of miles, but there are some approaches where it's listed in what's called RVR, or runway visual range. So what is RVR? RVR, or runway visual range, is visibility as measured in feet. It is basically what the visibility you could see down the runway in feet would be if you're sitting on the center line of the runway. They do have sensors to measure this, and this is measured or can be measured at several different locations on the same runway. Typically, most runways have a approach end sensor, a midpoint sensor, and a rollout sensor, and then some very long runways will have a fourth sensor, which is called the far end sensor. RVR minimums are designated by a slash after the MDA or DA. As you can see here with the statute mile visibility minimums, we have a dash and then the number. With the RVRs, we have a slash and then the number. Another hint that you're seeing RVR minimums and not statute mile minimums is most of your visibility minimums are going to be low single digits and fractions of that. and your RVRs are typically going to be high single digits or double digits. The way you read RVR minimums is that they are listed in hundreds of feet, but you drop the last two zeros. So 18 is 1,800 feet of runway visual range, 24 is 2,400 feet of runway visual range, and 4,000 or 40 is 4,000 feet of RVR. Of course, Flight Simulator right now does not report any visibilities in RVR. It's all done in statute miles. So if you do have approach minimums that are listed in RVR, there is actually a conversion table to convert RVR to miles or fractions of a mile. You'll notice that there is quite a bit of rounding up and down going on in this table. For example, 2,600 feet is actually the closest to half a mile, but they also allow you to call 2,400 RVR half a mile, all the way down to 1,800 feet. They allow you to call half a mile, even though 1,800 feet in reality is closer to 3/8 of a mile. So you can use this table if you have the minimums in RVR to convert them to what the statute visibility is at that airport and whether or not you can shoot that approach and land from that approach. It is worth noting that in real life, the FAA says that you do need to use this table for converting RVR values to statute miles and vice versa, and they tell you not to interpolate. In other words, if you have an approach that says it needs 4,800 RVR, there is not a 4,800 value in here, so you can't interpolate between 4,500 and 5,000. You just have to use the 5,000, round up, and use the 5,000, and that gives you one statute mile that's required to shoot that approach. So let's take a look at some examples of how we would read minimums. Let's say we were coming in on the ILS to runway 22 right in Little Rock, Arkansas. Identifier at the field is K Kilo Lima India Tango. So we've been cleared for the ILS. What is our decision altitude? So we go down to this line right here. This is the minimums for the straight in ILS to 22 right. First number we come to is our decision altitude. Since this is a precision approach, that is a decision altitude. So our decision altitude, or the altitude we want to see on our altimeter when we decide if we can see the runway and proceed to a landing, or if we need to go around, is going to be 462 feet. Next, they list the visibility, and it is listed in RVR, so we need 1,800 RVR to shoot the approach. If we use that conversion table, that converts to half a mile, so we need a half a mile visibility to be able to shoot the approach. The next number here tells us the height above touchdown of our decision altitude. So when we get to 462 feet on our altimeter, we are going to be 200 feet above the touchdown zone elevation for that runway. The last thing that I'll mention is you'll notice that it has only one set of minimums. So for all aircraft, all A, B, C, D category aircraft, the minimums are the same, and then there are no minimums published for category E aircraft. So let's assume now that we want to shoot the localizer approach rather than the ILS. Maybe the Glideslope transmitter is out of service, or maybe we just don't have a Glideslope receiver or Glideslope display on our aircraft. So we come down here to this line. This is the minimums for the straight-in localizer to 22 right. Since this is a non-precision approach with no vertical guidance, this is now a MDA, or a minimum descent altitude. So we will descend down to 680 feet on our altimeter for the minimums for this approach. The RVR is what they list the visibility in, so 2,400 RVR is what we need to descend from MDA down to the runway, and if you're a commercial operator, you need that prior to hitting the final approach fix as your reported visibility. We can convert that into miles using that table, and so that would convert to, again, half a statute mile, so we need at least a half a statute mile to shoot this approach. The next number here tells us our height above touchdown of the MDA, so when we get down to 680 feet on our altimeter, we are at 418 feet above the ground, or above the touchdown zone elevation for this runway. Another thing to note about this line of minimums is that we have two sets of minimums. We have one for category A and B aircraft. We have a separate set of minimums for category C and D aircraft. You'll notice that the MDA does not change, but that the visibility goes up. If we're flying a faster aircraft, we need 4,000 RVR rather than 2,400 RVR, which is going to be about 3/4 of a mile if they're reporting in statute visibility. And finally, if we are coming into runway, or if we're going to shoot the approach to 22 right, but we want to land on a different runway, we'll say that we're coming in to shoot the approach on 22 right, but we want to then make a kind of a left base to runway 1A. That would be considered a circling approach. And so we have a different set of minimums for that. You'll notice that there is a different set of minimums for each category of aircraft on that. Circling approaches are automatically MDAs. So this is an 800-foot MDA. That's what we will read on our altimeter and where we need to stop our descent. We need a mile of 1 statute mile visibility in order to shoot the approach and land from the approach. And then this number here tells us that for Category A aircraft, when we get to 800 feet on our altimeter, we're at 534 feet, and this would be above the airport, not above the touchdown zone. And you'll notice that for higher speed aircraft, for higher categories of aircraft, the MDA increases and the visibility increases as well for category C and D aircraft. And looking at minimums for an RNAV approach, they look a little bit different. We know that an LPV or an LNAV with VNAV has a decision altitude, but then an LNAV that has no vertical guidance is going to have an MDA, and they put that out pretty plainly in the minimums here. Otherwise, it just reads like any other minimums. You have your decision altitude or MDA, visibility, and height above touchdown. And you notice just like an ILS, LPV approaches typically have one set of minimums for all categories of aircraft. LNAV, VNAV are sometimes have different minimums for different categories of aircraft, and same for just the plain old LNAV. We'll get into this more when we get into GPS approaches, but it's always interesting to me that sometimes you will get lower minimums in one regard if you're shooting just a plain old LNAV approach versus an LNAV VNAV approach. So it's always good to look at the minimums and see which set of minimums serves you better if you're shooting in a GPS approach. But again, we'll get into detail on that when we actually get into GPS and RNAV approaches. So let's take a look at some of the areas on the chart that we haven't talked about yet. In the top left-hand corner, it lists the city that the airport is listed in under the FAA publications. So if you're looking this up in something like an airport facility directory, or if you're looking up like the approach minimums or obstacle departure procedures in the terminal procedures publication, you want to look under Little Rock, Arkansas. Sometimes in places like Dallas, airports like Addison are actually going to be listed under Dallas, Texas. So this will tell you what city you should look it up under, and you'll notice that information is also repeated down at the bottom left-hand corner of the chart. There is a number up at the center of the chart here, and then another reference number over here to the right. Those are FAA like filing and index numbers, and only the FAA really knows what those mean. On the top right-hand corner of the chart, we have the title of the procedure or the title of the approach, and you'll notice this says ILS or localizer runway 22 right. So this tells you that this is the chart for both the ILS approach and the localizer without the glide slope approach. Both approaches are represented on this plate. Underneath that, you have the formal name for the airport and the FAA three-letter identifier for this airport. The area of data that is between the plan view and the top of the chart is referred to as the briefing strip. And the top left of the briefing strip for a non-RNAV approach, you will have frequency or information about the primary nav aid that's used to fly the approach. So it tells you it's a localizer DME. It gives you the identifier of the facility. It gives you the frequency of the facility, and it gives you the TACAN channel if you are a military user. And this also tells civilian users that it again has DME. It gives you the approach course for the final approach. So the approach course is 227. Then it gives you some information about the runway. So the runway landing distance available for 22 right is going to be 8,273 feet. Then it tells you the touchdown zone elevation. That's going to be 262 feet above mean sea level. Touchdown zone elevation is defined as the highest point on the first 3,000 feet of the runway if the runway is 9,000 feet or greater, or the first third of the runway if it is less than that 9,000 feet. And then it gives you the airport elevation, which the this is going to be defined as the highest point on any usable runway. And you can see they're just slightly different between the two elevations there. On an RNAV approach where the frequency information is, there is some information about the GPS system. So this tells us that we have a wide area augmentation system, or this approach was designed to use a wide area augmentation system capable GPS. So we wouldn't really be able to shoot this if it was not that type of system. And then it gives us some channel information and things that we really can't see anything. I guess they felt obligated to put some information in there, but as far as I know, there's no way to pull up any of this data on your GPS and check it for accuracy or anything like that. The rest of the top portion of this briefing strip is the same. It still gives us the approach course. It gives us the landing length of the runway that the approach is designated for. It gives us touchdown zone elevation and airport elevation. So the next box down on the left is notes about the approach. In the top left here, it tells us the DME is required to be able to utilize this approach. Then it gives us the T triangle and the A triangle. We've discussed this in other videos, but the T triangle means that this airport has either non-standard takeoff minimums, an obstacle departure procedure, or has obstacle notes about the departure. So we want to jump into the TERPs and take a look at those. If we are departing this airport. The A means that this approach has non-standard alternate minimums. So if we want to file this airport as an alternate, we need to look that up. The rest of the notes are pretty much given in plain English. There's some commonly used abbreviations such as NA means not available. ALS means approach lighting system. So we can see here it says that simultaneous approaches are authorized with 22 left. So be aware if you're coming in real life on this approach, you may have a landing buddy over on 22 left flying the approach at the same time you are. It says that the VDP is not available when you use Stuttgart altimeter settings. Why would we do that? Well, it says down here, when local altimeter settings are not received, use the Stuttgart altimeter settings, and then you have to change all your decision altitudes and MDAs as listed in the notes down here. It also has some notes about if the approach lighting system is inoperative, that you need to change your minimums around a little bit there. It shows us what type of approach lighting system we have. It gives the name of the system. It's an ALSAF2, and it gives a little a picture of what the approach lighting system looks like. This is the big system with the two red bars on the sides. It gives us the missed approach instructions. You can see this one is a little more complicated. If we miss the approach, we need to climb to 1,000. Then we make a climbing right turn to climb to 2,300 and intercept the Little Rock 250 radial. Then we take the 250 radial out to Began intersection. You can see that's what is depicted here, straight out. Then make a right turn, intercept that radial, and then the actual missed approach is depicted up in the box up here. Down at the bottom, it has the frequency, and this is basically the frequencies in the order that you would use them in real life. First, you would get the ATIS, then you would contact approach, then you would go to tower, probably the most important frequency, and then you would go to ground control, and then on your way back out, you would go to clearance delivery. On the left side of the chart, you have the effective dates of the chart publication, the set of charts that this comes in. You can say this was effective on the 23rd of February 2023, and it will become ineffective on the 23rd of March, and they will issue a new set of publications. Not something you have to worry about as much with using digital charts. You can generally get the latest digital chart on the internet, or if you have a subscription, they should update it for you. But it's always good to check this just to make sure you're using the most recent data to make sure it's currently effective. Down at the bottom, we have some more information. Again, the city is repeated. It tells us what version of the approach you're on and when it was effective. So this is Amendment 3 Alpha. So this approach has been amended a few times, and the last time it was amended was the 8th of November of 2018. So this approach hasn't been changed in a while. It repeats the airport name and the identifier and the name of the procedure, and then it gives you the lat longs of the airport down at the very bottom center. On the bottom left, you have a little mini airport diagram. This repeats the airport elevation here and the touchdown zone information for this particular runway. The big D up here means that there is declared runway distance information available, which is detailed information about the takeoff distance available, landing distance available, that sort of stuff that's available in the airport facility directory if you want to look that up. They depict each runway in black, and then they give the runway numbers, they give the length of each runway and the width of each runway. And then they give information like the displaced threshold is indicated with these little oval lines here. You know that you have a displaced threshold for that runway. If that's the case, little dots here mean that it has runway centerline lighting. It tells you what type of approach lighting it has. All the A's are that, and there are codes for what type of system it is. So just an A is the ALSAF 2 system, and A4 is the smaller system. And you can actually look this up in the airport facility directory. Actually, I think it's the terminal procedures publication to see what all those mean. It gives you the location of the tower and tells you how high the tower is. It has an approach course line coming in to show you where the approach arrives from and the final approach course of that final approach segment. It depicts all the taxiways in kind of a light gray, though it doesn't give any detailed information about those. It tells you some things about the lighting at the runway. It tells you that there are medium intensity runway lights on 18 and 3.6. There's high intensity runway lights on 4 right, 2 left, and 4 left, 2 right. And then there's touchdown zone lighting and center line lighting on runways 4 left, 4 right, 2 left, and 2 right. And then it also gives for older approaches, for non-precision approaches without vertical guidance. One of the ways you can determine when you have arrived at the missed approach point is to start timing at your final approach fix, and then you look at the time based on the ground speed. These are all listings in ground speed here to tell you how long it would take to travel this distance between the final approach fix and the missed approach point. So it gives it for 60 knots, 90 knots, 120, 150, and 180. And, if you're flying something different, like we would be flying 75 knots in the 172, that would be about halfway in between 60 and 90 knots. So we would average these two numbers together to determine what our time would be when we're flying that speed. And so that's how, if we didn't have DME to determine where our missed approach point is on this approach, we could time it instead. And when we get to the end of that time, we know we've arrived at the missed approach point. And then I forgot to mention, it also gives you information about the visual glide slope indication systems. Basically, a P is for a PAPI and a V is for a VASI, so it shows you where those are located and what kind of system those are. Let's take a look at a few miscellaneous things about instrument approaches that you may run into as you look at the approaches available to you at different airports across the country and across the world. At many airports, there may be an approach or multiple approaches that have only circling minimums. There are a few different reasons why this can happen. Sometimes the approach arrives at an airport at an angle that's greater than 30 degrees from any runway's heading, either due to the position of the nav aid relative to the airport or because it was originally designed to be flown to a runway that's no longer there. Sometimes there may be no straight-in minimums because the descent angle would be too great to make a safe straight-in landing from the MDA. This is fairly common for approaches to airports in mountainous areas. When any of these things happen, the approach is published with only circling minimums. Any approach that is solely a circling approach will have a letter in the procedure title. For example, this VOR approach to Little Rock, Arkansas, Adams Field, is the VOR alpha, and it's the VOR alpha because it is circling only, and the reason it's circling only is it becomes in at an angle where we can't make a straight-in approach to any of the runways. Originally, this approach was designed because there was a runway right here. I believe it was runway 31. But in the 90s, that was decommissioned and made into a taxiway, but they retained the approach. And so now you have this VOR approach that is a circling approach only into Little Rock. If there's more than one circling approach at an airport, each approach will get a letter in the title, starting with the first one that's published getting the A and then going up the alphabet from there. For example, here at Kremlin, Colorado, we have a VOR DME alpha into the airport. And then we also have a circling only GPS approach that is the RNAV GPS Bravo. And it can go right on up the alphabet. There are some airfields, though, that used to have multiple circling approaches, but some have been decommissioned and they never went back and changed the letters in the approach titles. For example, we have two circling approaches into Aspen, out in Aspen, Colorado. We have a localizer DME Echo and an RNAV Foxtrot. And presumably there were other approaches that were Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta, but those approaches have been decommissioned and you can't use those anymore, but they never went back and changed the titles on the newer approaches so that they reverted back to being the Alpha and Bravo. I'll also mention that anytime you see slant DME and an approach title, that does mean that you have to have DME to fly that procedure. Something else you'll see at airports across the country is airports that have multiple approaches of the same type to the same runway, but where the procedures are slightly different. If we look at two of the approaches to runway 4 left in Detroit, you'll notice that we have two ILSs to Detroit, but if you look at the procedures, they're slightly different. They have different localizer frequencies. One of them is offset, and then if you look at the fixes on the final approach here, the fixes are also different, with the DME distances being different as well. So the way they differentiate these approaches is they label them with a letter. Since circling approaches got A and then went up, they start with Z and then go down. So the first approach that was designated here for 4 left at Detroit was labeled or designated the ILS Zulu, and then the second one they created was the ILS Yankee. And so that's how they differentiate between two approaches of the same type that go to the same runway when they're different procedures. Before we finish out the video, I want to talk about how to navigate onto an approach, and there are basically 4 ways that you can do it. In the real world, you can get ATC radar vectors, which is where they give you headings to basically steer you on to usually the final approach course. You can navigate to a feeder fix, something that's in the en-route environment, to fly a feeder route to an initial approach fix. You can navigate to an initial approach fix, either directly or through the en-route structure if it is part of the en-route structure. And you can navigate to the intermediate fix, usually with a GPS is the way you need to do this. In the real world, pilots get radar vectors onto approaches or headings to fly from ATC probably about 90% of the time. When doing this, a controller typically puts a pilot into a position where they are intercepting the final approach course somewhere between 3 and 5 miles from the final approach fix and at the intermediate approach altitude. Although they can vector an aircraft onto any portion of the approach that the pilot requests or that they deem necessary. I can't say I recommend using the in-game ATC system to try to do this. In fact, I don't recommend it really for any IFR flying. It's just not a great system for IFR flying. It's very quirky. It usually takes you way out of the way to do an instrument approach, and it just doesn't quite act right. There are virtual ATC services that can be used, such as VATSIM, but there may not be a control available in the area that you want to practice your approaches in, and some of them are not free. You can also use things like the in-game map, GPS moving map, and a program like Little Nav Map to give yourself vectors onto the approach. But this does take a little practice, and it can be distracting from actually flying the approach. So when you're starting out, I recommend using one of the traditional pilot nav ways to enter an approach when you first start trying to practice instrument approaches. It's important to realize that most instrument approaches are designed so that a pilot can navigate onto them via their own navigation without any assistance from ATC. Navigating to initial approach fix or a feeder fix are both pretty straightforward ways to do it, and the ways that once you navigate to that fix that you go through the rest of the approach are pretty well spelled out on the chart. If you want to start an approach by going directly to an intermediate fix, which is the fix that's labeled IF on the chart, you're generally going to need to use GPS. Most of these are not fixes that you can navigate to without using GPS, at least directly. If you do this in real life, there are a few restrictions that a controller needs to follow when clearing an aircraft direct to an intermediate fix to start an approach. This includes positioning the aircraft via vectors or whatever so that it doesn't have to make a turn greater than 90 degrees onto the intermediate segment, and assigning the aircraft an altitude to maintain until it's established on the approach. It's a good idea to follow that 90-degree rule if you're navigating on your own to the initial fix, or excuse me, to the intermediate fix, and you'll have to look at the charts to look at the MSA and look at the en route charts for the MEAs and off route altitudes to see what altitude you'd be safe to descend to until you're established on the approach if you're not using any sort of ATC. I'll also mention that in Flight Sim, it's possible to use a GPS to go directly to any fix on the approach and start the approach from there if you want to do that. So that concludes this video. Hopefully it's given you a good grasp of how the basics of instrument approaches work, how to fly them, and how to read instrument approach charts. Over the course of the next several videos, we'll be doing a deep dive into all of the various different instrument approaches you can fly in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and then demonstrating how to fly each of them. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to like it, and make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell to be notified when those videos come out. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.